Today marks day two of the South Africa Business Council, or the BRICS Business Council's discussion on various work streams. This is a platform for discussion and collaborations on energy infrastructure, aviation and the economy of the BRICS bloc ahead of the upcoming 15th BRICS Summit. South Africa will play host to delegates from Brazil, Russia, India and China for the summit in Sandton. That's taking place on the 22nd to the 24th. The event at Gallagher Estate, however, today is a build-up, and that's where we find SABC News economics reporter Katlego Legodi. Katlego, we're back to you once again. Where are discussions now?
A very good morning to you again, Criselda, and to our viewers at home. Of course, we are just continuing with our rolling coverage here on the ground at the Gallagher Convention Center on day two of the BRICS Business Council's meeting here, where we're seeing all of those working groups just spreading out to just continue with the discussions in terms of just contributing to the main report coming from the BRICS Business Council that will be taken to the main BRICS Summit in the coming days. We're just coming out of the working group looking at not infrastructure but agriculture in terms of what has been happening within this space, knowing very well that agriculture is very, very pivotal as well when you look at economic development for this BRICS nation. We know very well that this working group that we're going to be speaking to in a moment have been meeting frequently to just thresh out issues. We know very well that there have been concerns around issues of food security for this BRICS nation. Issues of climate change as well is one that features very heavy. The tariffs as well in terms of the exports and imports of some of these goods, agricultural goods coming out of South Africa into the African space, into some of these global markets, and those calls just continuing looking at the widening of exports for the agricultural sector. I'm going to bring into the conversation now Mr. Wandile Sihlobo. He is the chairperson of the Agri-Biz just working group here at the sector, or here at the BRICS Business Council, just looking at the work that you guys have been doing over time. We're coming out of that working group. You met very early in the morning, and it looks like there's been a move already. Maybe just let us in on where are you guys as we speak right now in terms of those well-needed interventions. Welcome to the SABC.
Thanks for having me on, Katlego. Indeed, it's been a productive period. And today we were mainly just taking stock to say, in all of the work that we've been doing over the past 8 months, what are some of the key points that we want to take forward as recommendation on the AGM, and of course share with the broader public on that. And as you rightly said in your introductory remarks, there's a number of things that we have discussed. We've looked at issues around deepening trade amongst the BRICS Business Council, because these member states of BRICS, some of them are major importers of agricultural products while others are major producers. If you just look at the imports of the BRICS in agriculture, they are over $200 billion US. So South Africa, for example, my home country, is one of those countries that is looking at broadening its exports. Then the question is to say, how do we deepen that trade? That was one of the points. The other point is around fertilizer usage, where we are thinking about how can we actually ensure that we promote the safe and the good use of fertilizer to boost agricultural productivity and deal with the food security matter that we are raising. And of course, sustainability, climate change, agricultural finance, those are some of the themes, but I think all of us have a shared vision on what we discussed this morning as our key recommendations.
So what are some of those recommendations coming from here, going into the main report, looking at the fact that this sector is very, very critical for sustainable development within the BRICS bloc, looking at these emerging economies and these markets? What are some of those recommendations?
I think one is deepening trade. And some of the BRICS countries, South Africa, Brazil, they're really looking at expanding exports either to China or to India. And there's an appetite from India and China to say, how do we absorb those exports, as well as in Russia? And the second one is to say, how do we increase the fertilizer trade amongst us as the member states, but also to the broader African continent? Because if you look at the fertilizer usage in Africa, it's still somewhere around about 19 kgs per hectare, while if you compare to South Africa or Brazil or the US, US, we are somewhere around about 90 kgs per hectare or even 120 kgs per hectare in the US and South America. And the third point is also around of saying, how can we promote sustainable agricultural practice amongst ourselves? Those are some of the key points that, of course, we are putting on the table. And we're also dealing with the SPS issues, phytosanitary measures, that are non-tariff blockages when we're thinking about trade. Those are some of the few points that are amongst a number of the recommendations that we are putting forward.
We saw just a move, you mentioned Brazil as well. I mean, we saw a move by the Minister of Trade to just talk about chicken and impose some of those barriers in terms of the anti-dumping for where chicken is concerned, especially looking at South Africa, its import and export of chicken. Just a lot of people not happy about that move to impose some of these issues. And it was a recommendation coming from the IAFF, just looking at how then we can move to ensure that we get the best out of the chicken space. Those concerns, are they warranted? And maybe let us in on what informed this recommendation to the minister around the chicken.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a point, of course, that was taken by the International Administration Trade of South Africa, that's the ITEC, recommending to the minister, and then the minister went ahead with the recommendation on that. While we all pursue and saying, look, we want a deeper trade amongst the BRICS countries, we know that there are sensitive industries that needs to be protected, and each member state will take its measures to protect those sensitive industries. But the broader key point here is to say, how do we sustainably deepen trade so that we move beyond the broader interaction that we are having, whereby commerce can also thrive amongst these countries? Because when we look at ourselves and we look at who's exporting what, who's producing what, we all hold different strength, and we think that there's a lot that can be done amongst ourselves. I mean, South Africa, for example, we're a net exporting country when it comes to agriculture. Just last year, we exported just under $13 billion of agricultural products, and that is half of what we produce in value terms. Going forward, we've been talking about agricultural master plans and all kinds of things to widen our agricultural production. The question then is to say, as we retain the EU and the other markets, how can we deepen trade with the BRICS countries? And I think that's an important thing, which was part of the discussion here of deepening trade.
But they're saying that chicken is expensive now, and that this move has really pushed the chicken prices up. What is your reaction to that?
I mean, I think on the chicken side, the question there is to say, how do we protect against the unfair practices to the South African industry? Of course, there will be the near-term pain that is there, but the question is about, in the long run, do we see the South African chicken industry recovering as a result of the protection and at some point being able to remain sustainable? One of the key things that have been challenging our poultry industry is the higher feed prices. Soybeans and the maize prices have been one of those things. And of course, the measures in place are in place because when there is dumping, there are rules at which you have to apply on that. But you have to be cognizant of the inflationary pressures, which I think the minister has consistently mentioned some of those things. But I think in the long run, these are temporary measures. The tariffs are not there to be permanent. At some point, there's review of all of these things, and we think that our poultry industry will thrive at some point.
Awesome. Let's talk about climate change. We know very well that a lot of farmers, a lot of people in the agricultural space are feeling hard done by where we find ourselves as the nation, as the globe, around this issue of climate change. Are we really prepared? Are we getting the best out of the agricultural sector to mitigate against what has been happening globally?
I mean, we all very worried, especially now, you and I knows about this, that we are now going to what we call an El Nino period, which means that it could be very dry in South Africa in the coming season. But fortunately, we do think that the agricultural sector could do reasonably well. Good soil moisture coming from a previous season. But I think when you talk broadly about the climate change, we do have to think a lot about climate smart agricultural practices, applying certain varieties of seeds that can withstand harsher climatic conditions, but also the farmers caring more about their soil health and the environment in general. And that's part of the points, by the way, that our friends in China have been very vocal about this and saying, look, we have certain practices that we want to share with BRICS countries, and they have tabled some of those. And beyond this conference, that's some of the things that we will all be collectively sharing these lessons in various forums with the South African farmers and farmers in India, in China, in Russia, and Brazil.
In your meeting, did you touch on the issue of financing, issues of funding that may be critical to ensure the sustainability of this sector? What are the people on the ground telling you? What are other nations doing to ensure that we safeguard this sector going forward?
I mean, that's a big one when it comes to finance. And as you know, the South African agricultural sector is capital intensive. I mean, we have a farm debt now that is hovering around about 200 billion rand, and it's been increasing at 9% year by year. But the positive thing about South Africa is that all of that farm debt has actually been used productively on investing and expanding agricultural production. But to your question, what have we learned from other members? There's a lot to learn from India, especially in supporting black farmers that are still entering the agricultural sector and in need of finance. What are some of the innovative financing solutions? That's something that we talked about. And of course, there's a work stream that is on finance in BRICS in general, which is looking at how do you then attract finance from elsewhere into South Africa. Once that finance is here, we think about various means then of supporting the sector.
Is it an exciting time for the agricultural sector, looking at the fact that also is one that is touted to ensure that there's economic growth, it contributes to the GDPs of these nations, and also work towards the job creation of well-needed jobs in the country right now? We saw the numbers at least going down of those that are unemployed and just attributed to various sectors. When we look at the agricultural space, can we say that it's best positioned to just come through for South Africans, come through for all of those young ones at home, maybe probably that are looking for opportunities? And also let's touch on the issue of land as well, which is something that is a cause for concern. We can just start with the jobs matter, and let's talk about the land issue, which is one that is very critical, especially if you're looking at rolling out mass-scale agricultural projects into some of these communities.
Katlego, you and I looked at these numbers last week. If you look at the agricultural employment in South Africa for the second quarter of this year, it was at the highest level since 2016. So good employment that is there, just under 900,000 people that are in this sector. If you take that and you take the agro-processing, where we have over 400,000 people that are there. So agriculture and agro-processing, they have over 1.3 million South Africans that are there. And there is opportunity to actually get even more people. If you think about the opportunities that could come at expanding production, expanding agro-processing, bringing new black players in place, there's a lot that we can achieve there. But I must insert one point before I move into land, which is very important, that as much as we talk about deepening trade with BRICS, this is not at the exclusion of existing markets in the EU, in the US, and elsewhere, because those are important markets. 40% of South Africa's agricultural exports go to Africa, 20% they go to the EU, and then you have some that are go to Asia and elsewhere. The BRICS countries, as we speak, they only account for 8% of South Africa's agricultural exports, which is why then in the recommendation we say deepen trade in this grouping, especially as it imports a lot. That's important for us. And then where are the products going to come from? It brings to your second point about the land. We have in South Africa roughly 4 million hectares of land that can still come in all forms of agricultural production, some of it on livestock, some of it on crops, some of it on a horticultural space. And that land, it's where a number of black players will actually be coming on, which is why we talk about growing the South African agricultural pie. And I think that infrastructure will be needed, financing will be needed on dealing with that. But on a land policy, the South African government will have to be thinking about saying, look, can you extend some of the title deeds, long-term tradable leases on that to attract investments? Those, though, are domestic policies. But I think in one way or another, they will complement the work that is happening on BRICS when it comes to trade and the other forms.
And just before I let you go, Mr. Sihlobo, have you identified risks going into the BRICS Summit? So we know very well that everything here will be consolidated. It will be taken into the main report. But what are those risks that you have identified that maybe as we go along as the agricultural space and these working groups, you'd want for more attention to be there, to be given there, so that we really don't see some of these plans not come to pass?
I mean, what we're thinking about now is, of course, to say there has to be forums that are beyond the conference, because the conference is not the end on itself. The delivery mechanism of all of these points are some things that will be needed. And of course, there are even broader things that are negative we have to be watching after: the issue of climate change, the issue of using non-tariff barriers, because you can lower the tariffs to open trade and then people can start using phytosanitary issues and other non-tariff barriers that will counter what you have already done on trade. So those are some of the things. But I do think that delivery mechanism, so that we are not in a just conversation, is around those conferences, those working groups that will need to follow through and deliver the work at a technocratical level beyond the policy positions that we're talking about.
Mr. Sihlobo, thank you very much, sir, for your time and everything of the best. Really, when you look at it, this working group, a lot of work underway when you look at how he's saying that these conversations have been ongoing for about 8 months now. They're done. They've wrapped up. They've consolidated. They're taking some of these recommendations into the main report. But just talking about the deepening of trade and how important it is. 8%, that is not enough in terms of what South Africa contributes into the BRICS bloc where the agricultural sector is concerned. But we're looking at also interacting later on, Griselda, with some of those that are showcasing here as part of just the exhibitions, those that are in the agricultural space, just to hear it from them in terms of what they would expect just coming into the BRICS Summit and what are some of those issues, burning topics that they would want to be addressed going forward. Griselda?
Katlego, thank you very much indeed. Speaking to a number of delegates there, of course, at the second day of that BRICS Business Council. A number of issues being discussed there, as Katlego has been giving us some insight into. Thank you very much indeed, Katlego.